Okay, I'll talk about a new paradigm that we are working on in my group, which we term open knowledge representation with the orientation of text. Just a couple words about myself. I'm in the area of natural language processing. This is a text session. Together with Yoav Goldberg, we had a lab at Bar Ilan, a natural language processing lab at Bar Ilan University. I think it's the largest lab in Israel. I would also like to mention, beyond my own research area, maybe it's a good opportunity to mention that at Bar Ilan we are also now establishing a data science institute that I'm heading. So if people are interested in data science in more general, in data science activities, you're welcome to approach me. So let's get started. So motivation. As you see, I was talking about knowledge representation in my title, and maybe the most famous form of knowledge representation is today popular is knowledge graphs. This is an example of the free-based knowledge graph. It's a graph that is an initiative that was purchased by Google and became the basis for Google's knowledge graph, and many other companies are now building large knowledge graphs. Knowledge graph is basically a structure for representing facts. You see here a snippet like we have nodes about concepts like Barack Obama, the abstract concept of being a politician, concrete concept of Honolulu, the location, and edges represent facts. So basically we have here representation of concepts, entities, and facts relating them. Something a little bit less consistent in the structure. I mean, nodes can be concepts, but if a relation or a fact has more than just two arguments, then it may have a node on its own, like this event 8. So you can see generally, you could think in a more general way that you have some graph. Nodes may represent concrete concepts or events or relations that connect them, and edges make the connections between these elements, these concepts and elements. So that's basically knowledge graphs are usually used to select some selected to encode some selected facts about the world as propositions. So I'll use this form, right? Each such fact technically is typically referred as a proposition. They are useful. It's a good thing. They allow structured presentation, querying, inference are used for many things. But one notable characteristic of the common approach for knowledge representation is that you have to pre-specify the vocabulary or the ontology or the taxonomy of your knowledge graph. So if you're now building a knowledge graph for a new domain, you're in a certain vertical market and you want to build something for automotive, you'll have to define all the concepts or the relations in your domain in order to be able to put them into your knowledge graph. So practically you're kind of inventing a new formal language in order to encode your knowledge. And this means that there's some scalability issues. I mean, it's very hard to encode freely any type of knowledge that would come up, that people would communicate to each other. And indeed, knowledge graphs typically encode only a tiny fraction of knowledge. If you have a knowledge graph about Obama, it will tell some basic facts about it, about Obama, but not most of the things, let's say, that have been written about Obama in the last decade, okay? A very tiny fraction of knowledge. So our motivation, our approach is to raise two questions. First, can we try and take something similar, try to build some structure on top of knowledge in a way that will be more accessible for computation, but to do that for unbounded information that practically, right, humankind communicates knowledge through natural language or through texts, okay? So can we try and take the information that's out there in textual form that people are writing and communicating and try to build something in the spirit of knowledge graphs for that? And then the other question is, how can we communicate it effectively? And the kind of answers we are trying to provide, and I'll just give a very high-level overview of in this talk, is to try and define what we call an open knowledge representation paradigm that is based on natural language. And the key idea is that you will use the primitives of the natural language that already exist. People already invented their own natural languages to communicate, to talk about concepts and relations. Can we build something that's based on that, but still will have some structure and the flavor and the usefulness of knowledge graphs? And the other aspect is that while such representation will have many, will be useful in many cases for many applications regarding information and text, Particularly, I think it can be also a key enabler for developing a new types of information access or knowledge consumption applications, which if you think about it, it's an area that has been stumbling somewhat. I mean, natural language processing has really been booming in the last decade, and it's everywhere in the industry. But if you think where it's in, so it's a lot in analytics, a lot in chatbox communication, but the way we consume knowledge hasn't changed that much. If you want to learn some facts about, last week's news events, or you want to learn something about elephants, the way you would have to access the knowledge, to consume the knowledge, will still be through tedious reading. And if you want to look at multiple sources, which is usually the case, there will be redundant information. It hasn't changed. And maybe if we'll have a good way to represent the key knowledge in a collection of text, if we'll have a good way for that, it could also be an enabler for developing new types of knowledge or text exploration applications. And I'll give an initial demo that we are now developing. Okay, so that's the motivation. To make things more concrete, I'll also share with you the kind of domain, which is the first domain we're working on when we're trying to develop this paradigm, and that's news tweets. Okay, so whenever there is some news event, might be a terrorist attack, a debate, some performance, art performance, etc. Of course, we can read about it in the news websites, but also in Twitter, there are many news tweets that get streamed, generated in Twitter and tell us about what's going on in this event. And these are usually not actually in the typical kind of social media, social tweetish language, but they are in good plain language, depending on the language. Here the examples are in English. So here's an example. There has been some event, and this is a cluster, so I'll assume at this point that we can somehow cluster a set of tweets that regard a certain event, using hashtags, the text, etc. This is an easier task. And we get a cluster like this. So we can ask what is actually being said here. So to understand, we should start reading tweet by tweet. And we might see there that was some plane flying here from Russia, from Moscow. This plane was forced to land by Turkey, was grounded, was intercepted, different ways to say the same thing. This plane was carrying ammunition. It was a passenger plane, civilian passenger plane. That's probably why it was grounded by the Turks, and so on and so forth. So we can go with our marker and try figuring out what the facts are. Okay? We can feel that this looks very different than the nice knowledge graph I showed at the beginning, the Google, the free-based knowledge graph, right? Because here, particularly, I'd like to point at two characteristics of textual information that we'll have to deal with. One, which is very prominent, is redundancy. Okay? On almost every topic, there will be many texts produced. Much of the information will get repeated there, even though it might get repeated in different words, which makes things more difficult. And the other one is that still we have complementary information that is scattered. So talking about the carrying of ammunition, so maybe one tweet mentioned the ammunition, another says where, the origin and the destination, and here for whom this ammunition was targeted, etc. So we'd like somehow to put together all these facts as it would be in a nice knowledge graph. Okay? So the question would be, how can we take all this information and build something more structured and consistent out of it? Okay? Before describing our approach, I have to give a little bit of background on what natural language processing NLP technology offers us that's already related to the problems we are trying to address. So one thing NLP technology knows how to do is to take a sentence like Danny arrived to the restaurant to meet Sarah into the, let's call it atomic, I'll be a little bit informal, atomic facts or atomic propositions embedded in a sentence. If you think of a sentence in natural language, it usually bundles together a set of facts. And it's up to the author's choice often which facts to bundle together in each sentence. So what we would like to do, and NLP technology allows us, is to break it to the atomic facts, right? Because in a structured knowledge graph, you'd like to isolate each fact on its own. So we can break something like this to, let's drill down here. Danny arrived to the restaurant to meet Sarah, and Danny meets Sarah, when we can break what the predicate is, what the argument, what the arguments are. So that's one thing we know. Another thing that NLP technology knows how to do at different levels of success is to deal with what's called a coreference resolution, meaning identifying that different pieces of text, different expressions in the text appearing in different places in a document or in different documents refer to the same thing in the real world. So this might happen, here we see three different sentences taken from three different texts talking about Lindsay Lohan checking into a rehab center, okay? So we can know that Lindsay Lohan, Miss Lohan, and the actress refer to the same entity in the world. Similarly, the Treatment Society Rehab, Betty Ford Center, all refer to the same entity in the world. We can also identify the checked into, enter, checked into, all refer to the same event or relation that holds between Betty Ford and the rehab center in the world. Okay, so we have both like entity coreference and event coreference, and we can also do the alignment and understand that, yeah, Lindsay Lohan is like the subject of this predicate, or the first argument of this predicate, just like Miss Lohan here is the subject of this predicate, and we can align these structures and know that they actually correspond to the same fact or description situation in the real world. Okay, so we can know how to do that. And the last thing we know is that when we have such coreferences, actually something that applies about Betty Ford also applies about the actress, right? Because they refer to the same thing. So we can substitute elements that co-refer with each other. And these are things that are being done separately in text processing. So what we would like to do is actually to take these two basic technologies of breaking things to atomic facts and figuring out what elements refer to the same thing, to the same entity or relation in the real world, and somehow merge and collapse them together. Okay? So everything will be represented just once. And this way we'll get rid of the redundancy. And we'd also like to trace this redundancy. I won't say much about this, because still we might have different descriptions of the actress and Betty Ford, and we'd like to know how much amount of information each of them gives us, and we'll try to model that as well. Okay? So that's what we are going to do. And I'll illustrate our approach through an example, okay, how we build these graphs. So let's look at a new example. We have here 4 sentences describing the acquisition of a coffee chain called Pasqua by Starbucks in a collection of documents that describe the development of Starbucks to its huge status where it is now. And this can be also an example. You may want to learn something about Starbucks. You search Google, you get 100 documents. Okay, how do I figure out what are the main facts about the evolution of Starbucks? Okay, so this is an example. So what we're going to do, we're going to apply the kind of technologies I just mentioned. So we will first break, let's look at this sentence for example, I'll break it to the individual facts. Each such small graph represents an individual facts. And then I can take all these small facts and put them together in something that starts looking like a knowledge graph. Okay, so I have here both the entities like the Starbucks, the 56 outlets, etc., as well as the relations, the adding, the acquired, etc. Okay? Notice I don't even have to point to color what is a predicate and what is an entity. Everything relates to something, to some situation or some scenario, some element in the described world, in the scenario we are describing, in this case, the activities of Starbucks. You can think of something like a hurricane. Just figuring out whether it's predicate or entity, it's a tricky question, so we try to avoid that. Okay? And the edges will make the relationships. Yeah, the subject of the adding was Starbucks, and it was adding 56 outlets. And to what? To the network. And this network belonged to Starbucks. Okay, start filling the structure. Now we can have the 4 sentences. Each of them generates such a graph. Now again, we'd like to merge them together to get rid of all the redundancy and put together the complementary information. So we use these coreferences that I mentioned. We know that they and Starbucks are the same entity. We know that the bought, the purchased, the acquired are all the same event or relation in the world. And further, we know that this connection between the they and bought or the Starbucks and the acquired is the same relationship between that activity and the agent of that activity. So now what we are going, basically all these things that co-refer, we are going to collapse. So if we have these 3 edges, we just make them one edge. If we had these 4 nodes, we'll just collapse them into one node, and we'll end up with one big structure that actually captures all the information in the 4 original sentences. Okay? And notice something else, since everything is collapsed here, one thing we get immediately for free is that if something was described in many of the texts, and therefore is probably more important, more salient, maybe is a thing we want to show first to users, for example, we know that. We know that this maybe was mentioned in all of this acquisition that was acquired or bought or purchased, occurred in all 4 sentences. It's more important. Maybe the date is a bit less important, or you know, the fact it was in the US is a bit less important for the story. Okay? So that's the kind of structure we get. Now, once we put up this, I just mentioned that we've already done an initial annotation. We have a gold standard for this structure by doing human annotation, and we now developing the first version of our baseline to generate these graphs automatically. We already have some of the things working, but we're now in integration phase. I'd like to talk more about the potential applications, assuming that such technology, because it relies on known problems in NLP, it can be set up. I'd like to talk about applications. So the first thing is, if you think of information-related applications, natural language processing applications, most of them don't deal with a single text. They're usually interested in in a collection of text about the topic of interest. So if I'd like to ask the system some questions about Starbucks, I'd like it to collect information from all the documents describing the evolution of Starbucks, not just from a single text. Question answering, summarization, obviously you would like to take the whole cluster of text about Starbucks and generate a summary. Analytics, you want to do some business analytics. Again, you'd like to consider a collection of documents. Nowadays, the standard NLP pipeline, again, I assume most of the audience is not NLP people, but NLP is an active area, active field, and there are many tools, and now we don't start, when you develop an NLP application, you don't start from scratch. You download kind of the whole NLP pre-processing pipeline, but this pre-processing pipeline usually stops at a single sentence or a single text, okay? So some of these applications do their own internally, some of the kind of activities that I was mentioning. But what we are actually proposing is that if we properly define what does it mean to encode the semantics or the information in a set of text, in a set of 100 documents about Starbucks, now we can try and develop into the NLP pipeline a tool that takes 100 documents and gives you a graph. And now if you're building your question answering system or your summarization system, take our graph as input rather than dealing on your own with 100 separate documents, okay? That's the main proposal for NLP technology in general. And the second aspect that I promised talking about is, in the particular application we are interested in, as I mentioned, I think this opens the door to start developing new types of applications that enable you to consume information coming from collections of text, okay? And this I just show very quickly. So what we are now doing, we are developing, we already done some initial user studies, we have a first version of an application that takes such a cluster of tweets, like I showed before, for instance, on the Syrian plane, and try to consolidate them together. I just jump, I'm running out of time, so I'll just jump to the screenshots. So basically what it does will take the most prominent facts from the graph, those that are most bolded in the illustration I showed before, and we'll put them together along a timeline. In this case, when you want to view information about events, timeline is useful. You can see that if you want to look at a certain fact that was derived from the graph, you can look at all the original tweets that, from which this fact originated. Facts that we are not showing, we will show them, like here, that there are 2 facts in this part of the timeline that are a bit less important, but you can explore them if you like. And we'll also allow you to somehow track the amount of knowledge that you see, so you can see how much of the story I've seen so far. Maybe at this point, I'll just use half a minute to really show you how it looks like interactively, just to get a feel. So we have here a story about some, as you can see, about many tweets, like over 100 tweets. Some suicide bomber attacks church in Kaduna. Jonathan condemns the attack. Bomb attacks hits Nigeria church, etc., with a lot of redundancy, but complementary information. When we derive the most salient information from the graph, we can see that all these 100 tweets, we have a shared-holding mass, gets hit by explosion, how many were wounded or dead, and some reprisals. So in a few lines, you get to see what the main issues are. Now, reprisals, since reprisals probably appeared in many different tweets, and each of them was giving different amount of information, for instance, we can learn that these are reprisals. Yeah, okay, reprisal attacks for people seeking revenge. It gives you a little bit of the flavor of what's going on here. So I'll just conclude. I'll just conclude. We have some positive user studies results. Basically, I was talking about two things. Information is encoded, most knowledge in the world is encoded in text, and it's encoded in multiple texts. We need efficient structures to represent the consolidated information coming from multiple texts, and we need to add this to the text processing pipeline. And the other thing, I think we should start looking for more advanced methods for allowing us to browse in such a space of information after we've properly structured it. Thanks.
Questions?
Okay, your thoughts about using this to find contradictory information in such text, to find what's consistent between things and where there are conflicts.
Yes, so one thing I haven't touched is this, for instance, so I didn't have time to mention, what we try to model within all these redundancies, so if you have many descriptions of the same fact, one thing you want to find is the amount of information given. So we'd like to know that, for instance, Betty Ford is more specific than the actress, okay? There is some entailment relationship. Once you start defining the inference relations between them, a very natural thing you want to put in, and we already put in some of that action notation, is contradiction. If two statements talk about exactly the same event, but they have some contradiction, we'd like to model that. So definitely the graph would like to capture that as well.
Can you go back to your Starbucks example?
Sure.
So one thing that bothered me is what would happen if you have multiple facts, like multiple, coffee shops that Starbucks has bought. And then I would like to maybe, I don't know, sort them by the order by which they were bought. But it seems that your relationship are binary, and therefore it would be difficult for me to know that one coffee shop was bought at 98 and another one at 99 and so forth.
No, it's not because the buying event, if different shops were bought, these would be different buying events. I mean, up to the success of my event coreference resolution to figure out that these are different buying events. But if you have, for instance, temporal hits, that would be actually, in this case, it might be an easy case because they might have happened in different times, they might be reported at different times, so I will be able to figure out that these are different buying events. Each buying event will have its own different node.
Subgraph.
Yeah, a kind of subpart of the graph with its own time and its own acquirer, but Starbucks may be the acquirer in all buying events.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much again.
Thanks.